Let me continue to read the book Life's Edge by Carl Zimmer, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. This part is chapter 2, Death is Resisted, and it is the last part. In 1967, Beecher organized a committee at Harvard to figure out how to define this mysterious new state. Marie and other doctors joined him, as did a lawyer and a theologian. They immediately launched into fierce debates for months, but eventually they agreed on a report that they published in 1968 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. It offered a new standard for declaring a patient died, the death of the brain. The committee argued that medicine had to free itself from obsolete notions of life and death. A stopped heartbeat had once been a reliable way to rule someone dead, since it led to the lungs and the brain failing too. Now, doctors had the means to keep a heart beating even when the brain was damaged beyond hope. These improved activities can now restore life as judged by the ancient standards of a persistent respiration and a continuing heartbeat, the committee wrote. Beecher and his committee spoke of life rather than life. Massive brain damage often left patients without the remotest possibility of recovering consciousness. The committee declared, if doctors determined that their patients had a brain death syndrome, as the committee called it, the time had come to declare their patients dead. The committee recommended that doctors carry out a series of tests before making the declaration. A patient's EEG reading should be flagged. The pupils should be fixed and dilated. The doctors should shut off the ventilator for a few minutes to make sure a patient could not breathe without it. Some members of the committee thought doctors should repeat these tests for 3 days in a room, but the transplant surgeons found this delay too long, with desperate patients waiting for organs. They persuaded their colleagues to knock the recommendation down to just 1 day. A doctor could then declare a patient dead and shut down the ventilator. The committee advised the doctors never to reverse that order. Otherwise, the physicians would be turning off the respirator on a person who is, under the present strict technical application of law, still alive, they warned. The committee's report was loaded with helpful guidance, but it was sorely lacking in argument. Beecher and his colleagues simply asserted that patients with brain death syndrome should be declared dead. Rather than making a case for it, they raised huge questions, which they left hanging. When the committee claimed the people with brain death syndrome had no hope of regaining consciousness, for example, did they mean that consciousness was the essence of life? These gaps went overlooked when the report came out. The New York Times put it on their front page with the headline, Harvard panel asked definition of death be based on brain. Doctors in the United States and other countries swiftly fell in line. A decade later, a Harvard surgeon named William Sweet looked back at the 1967 meeting and judged it unquestionable success. The inescapable logic of the concept that death of the brain is equivalent to death of the person has now achieved widespread acceptance, he wrote. That acceptance gradually became law. States began adopting what came to be known as the whole brain standard. People with an irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem, as the law put it, are dead. On December 9, 2013, a girl named Jihi McMath was admitted to Children's Hospital in Oakland, California, for a minor procedure to treat her snoring. A surgeon removed her tonsils and a part of her palate, and a few hours later, she was awake and enjoying a popsicle. But an hour later, Jahi was splitting up blood. Less than 5 hours after that, her heart stopped. Jahi's medical team rushed to her aid and got her heart beating again, but they had to put her on a ventilator. The following morning, when doctors examined her, they determined she had suffered a devastating lack of oxygen. No brain waves appeared on her EEG. Her pupils didn't react to light. 45 years had passed since a Beecher's committee had mapped out the concept of a brain death, and Jahi's doctors now decided she clearly met its standards. 3 days after her disastrous surgery, Jahi McMath was declared dead. Thanks to the ventilator, her lungs still inflated with air and her heart still beat. A social worker met with Jahi's stunned and devastated family to talk about shutting it off, but their experience with the medical staff had left them embittered. When Jahi started splitting up blood, her family had begged for help, and it only came slowly. Later, it emerged that the doctor in charge had made a note that her carotid artery was unusually close to her tonsils, which the hospital staff apparently overlooked. Now the social worker left Jahi's family feeling as if the hospital was leaning on them to kill her. They refused to agree to turning off the ventilator and instead asked for it to be kept running, and they also asked for a feeding tube so that Jahi would not starve to death. The hospital refused to give care to someone who had just been declared dead, so the family went to court with their demand. Plaintiffs are Christians with firm religious belief that as long as the heart is beating, Jahi is alive. Their lawyer, Christopher Dolan, told the judge. The judge ordered that an independent neurologist review the case. He came to the same conclusion as the hospital's doctors. Jahi was dead. Her beating heart was irrelevant. All that mattered was the state of her brain. After more negotiations, the family and the hospital reached an agreement. A coroner would issue a death certificate, and then the hospital would release Jahi to her family, still hooked to ventilator. Using funds raised online, Jahi's mother, Nellie Winfield, put her on a plane and flew with her across the continent. They landed in New Jersey, a state that allows family to reject brain death on religious grounds. Most doctors and bioethicists found this turn in Jahi's case deeply frustrating. Brain death was death. Some experts hinted that moving Jahi's body to New Jersey was just a ploy cooked up by Dolan in order to squeeze money after the hospital in a lawsuit. She is going to start to decompose. Bioethicist Arthur Kaplan told U.S. Today. By the time Jackie was settled in at her new hospital, she hadn't eaten for 3 weeks. When doctors gave her a feeding tube, she began to improve. Most patients declared brain dead within hours or days. But Jackie remained alive week after week, months after week. Her teenage body was growing. She began to menstruate. In August 2014, Nila moved Jackie out of the hospital and into an apartment. Nurses cared for Jackie round the clock, and Nila helped them turn Jackie every 4 hours to protect her from bed sores. Meanwhile, Jackie's family launched a lawsuit against the Children's Hospital Oakland for malpractice. A non-profit foundation paid for a doctor to give her a new battery of neurological tests. Dolan later announced that the test revealed that some regions of her brain were still intact, with blood flowing through them. He asked a California court to have Jackie declared alive. Once again, they turned his request down. 3 years later, a staff writer for The New Yorker named Rachel Aviv paid a visit to the apartment. Nila showed Aviv videos she had taken on her cell phone. In the jumpy movies, Jackie moved her fingers or toes, seemingly in response to her family and her nurses. When Nila asked Jackie to move a finger, Aviv saw it move with what looked like a flicker of agency. I could also be investing undue meaning in gestures nearly too subtle to discern, she later wrote. The case of Jackie McMath opened up a debate about the meaning of brain death. The more it unfolded, the more it became clear that the debate ran in striking parallel to the one over abortion. It came down to what we think it means to be alive, and more particularly, what it means for us humans to live. Ever since the Harvard meeting in 1967, some critics had questioned the logic of brain death, and Jackie's case now threw their questions in high relief. How could someone diagnosed with brain death have a heart that continued beating for years? How could she enter puberty and possibly even respond to commands? Alan Sherman, a California neurologist and a longtime critic of the brain death diagnosis, was invited by the McMath family to look over their videos and tests. I'm convinced that for early 2014, Jackie McMath was in a minimally conscious state, he later declared. Sherman speculated that when Jackie had stopped breathing, her brain stem had been badly damaged, but parts of her cerebral cortex remained intact. That would mean she did not meet the whole brain standard for brain death, even though her exams indicated she did. Sherman speculated that the physicians who examined Jackie missed the fleeting moments when she could respond to the outside world. Robert Truog, a Harvard pediatric intensive care physician, favored another possibility. Jahi really had met the criteria for brain death after surgery in 2014, but she no longer did, Shrag suggested. Perhaps Macbeth actually improved somewhat, rising a little on the spectrum of a brain injury. Shrog wrote in 2018, "This would not seem to be surprising in itself, but what makes this conceptually important would be that in so doing, she would have crossed bright legal lines we have drawn between the living and the dead." Other doctors were more skeptical. They were more not impressed by the second-hand accounts of the cell phone videos. Still, no one denied that Jahi had gone through puberty. That transition is governed by the hypothalamus in the brain. Among its many tasks, the hypothalamus is responsible for releasing the hormones that trigger a child's body to mature. The fact that Jahi experienced puberty meant that at least this one small part of her brain was still intact. The hypothalamus may be more resilient than the rest of the brain, thanks to its peculiar anatomy. It sits at the base of the brain, where it is nourished by a dedicated set of arteries. No one knows for sure how many other people who have been diagnosed as brain dead had an intact hypothalamus, but there are hints that many did. Among its other jobs, the hypothalamus manages the body's salt balance. It does so by squirting a hormone called vasopressin into the bloodstream. The hormone is exquisitely fragile, surviving only minutes after its release. To keep a body's level of salt steady, the hypothalamus has to monitor it and provide a steady supply of vasopressin. If a stroke or a tumor destroys the hypothalamus, it throws off the body's salt balance, leading to a condition called diabetes insipidus that can damage the kidneys. In 2016, a team of researchers reviewed medical information on 1,800 patients who were diagnosed as brain dead. Some of them suffered from diabetes insipidus, suggesting that their hypothalamuses were no longer working, but some did not have the condition. The researchers concluded that roughly half of the patients showed signs that their hypothalamus was still regulating their salt. One of the authors of that study was Michael Neil Collins, a bioethicist at Florida State University. He went on to publish a series of articles on the whole brain standard for brain death. He argued that the patients simply cannot be a whole brain failure if a part of their brain, in this case the hypothalamus, is still working. If doctors come to that conclusion, and if doctors come to that conclusion after exam, Neil Collins said the problem does not lie in the patient's brain, but in the exam, or perhaps with the concepts of life and death that the doctor rely on.